Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, exploring how we can push the boundaries of the public sector and communities with services around digital technology. My name is Craig Taylor, I'm the Cloud Solutions Manager at Phoenix, and I'm joined today by a fantastic panel of guests who represent the broad spectrum of public services that are in the UK today. Would you mind just briefly introducing yourselves for the benefit of the viewers, please?
Good
Starting with
Craig.
Richard.
Richard Williams. I'm the Director of Enterprise and Development at NCVO, which is a membership organisation, the National Council for Voluntary Organisations. Over 15,000 members, and obviously digital and technological and transformation is hugely important in terms of how they'll deliver their services best and how they can use their donor money more efficiently.
I'm Brian Fisher. I'm a GP. I have 3 hats today. As well as being a GP, I'm also chair of NHS Alliance, and we're a national organisation, and we try to help tackle health inequalities through community action and health creation. And I'm also clinical director for a software company called Evergreen, and we're on the NHS framework, and we make it possible for people to book appointments with their GP, access their GP records online, and also keep as fit and well as possible.
Great, thank you.
Good afternoon, Craig. I'm Nadira Hussain. I'm the Director of Leadership Development and Research at SOCITM. For those of the audience that don't know, SOCITM is the Society of Innovation, Technology and Modernisation. We too are a membership organisation that serve digital leaders across public sector, primarily local government, 2,000 or so of our members. We are the representative voice of local government. We very much lobby on behalf of our members. We're also we deliver products and services very much in response to key policies and priorities that have been championed on behalf of our members. In my role specifically, leadership development and research, it is to facilitate the delivery of leadership academy programs, but also to really be mindful and progressing the succession planning, the pipeline management, the talent of our sector and the organisations that we support.
Fantastic, thank you, Nadira.
Hello, Craig. My name is Carolyn Brown. I'm Chief Technology Officer at the National Housing Federation. We're also a membership body who represent approximately 800 housing associations in England. We lobby politically and socially for essentially to be the voice of the sector and to represent what the sector needs and wants. We conduct a lot of events ranging from all kinds of operational to strategic topics for our membership, and we also have products and services that we carry due diligence out on in terms of their benefit to the organisations.
Great, thank you, and thank you all for joining us. I think this is going to make for a really interesting discussion, given those introductions, so thank you. I think we'd all agree that citizens, staff, everyone's benefiting in some way, potentially from digital technology. But why don't we start off the discussion? Carolyn, if it's okay if we come back to you on how do you think that's specifically helping the housing associations through the use of digital technology?
I think housing associations are complicated businesses. There is a huge amount of social responsibility to the tenants, whilst also conducting a vast array of operational activity that actually makes that work. So anything that's digital in terms of its enablement is obviously going to be a huge advantage. And you could, I suppose, put that into 2 camps. On the one hand, if you look at buildings themselves, no matter what they are, you could think of IoT devices that can be put into buildings in order to use sensor technology, particularly new buildings. And we've got big innovative programs that are being rolled out that are actually looking at that to actually influence the way that new builds incorporate these new technologies. I mean, that could be as simple as, sensors for boilers to alert when the maintenance is coming up rather than waiting for them to break down. On the one hand, to the other side, where you might have a voice-activated alarm as opposed to an old pull string for somebody who needs care. So there's a whole swathe of initiatives and technologies that can be put into place. And if you look at the operational side of the business, well, digital interfaces to enable those who want to use, botnets and putting things out online as opposed to through call centres.
Yeah.
Of course, that technology, reaps huge amount of benefits.
And helping with workers' productivity and some of the things you mentioned there.
Well, keeping your transaction costs down, absolutely.
It's really interesting. And Nadira, just in your role at SOCITM, you must see this from a range of different angles, but could you just explore that with us a little bit?
Absolutely. So what we're seeing is just wholesale change to the way in which organisations are now able to think differently. So far more in terms of innovation, creativity, thinking outside of the box. Technology's the pace of change is so exponential that actually to keep up is sometimes quite difficult for public sector organisations. So let's focus on the aspect of collaboration first. So what we're seeing is a sea change in terms of moving away from the coalition of the willing to those who actively want to participate. It's almost, people are now seeing where there are good examples and best practices being shared, they are now seeing the art of the possible. So it's about building the trust and confidence as to what can be achieved through the delivery of digital technology, that people want to share in the experiences and learn from those. So we're having more discussions as to how people can join up and move away from the kind of silo mentality that's perhaps existed previously. And collaboration, I think, is important both from an organisation's perspective, so where we've perhaps had support services working in isolation, HR, procurement, ICT, finance, it is now evident that actually support services need to work in a cohesive way to deliver business requirements. Sure. Across organisations, then, council to council, sharing of that best practice, learning from others, preventing the reinvention of the wheel is absolutely where we need to be taking this, because we're limited in terms of funds. Why do we keep doing the same thing? So we are seeing a little bit more of a joined up approach across organisations. And then finally, organisations like ours at SOCITM are signposting and reaching out to the likes of the Local Government Association, SOLIS, SIPFA, MHCLG. How can we ensure more of a joined up experience? So that's the context. But in terms of on the ground then, if we look at the workforce, improved flexibility, productivity, mobility, which actually should impact the way in which services are delivered and improve the workforce satisfaction, should improve the delivery of services to the people in the community that are receiving public services. We've also talked about across organisations, the sharing of that intelligence. If we use data and the insight of data to give more evidence-based opportunities, then we can link organisations to move them away from that silo-based mentality. For people in the community, of course, and Carolyn's already touched on it, we can use the channel shift and help those who can use the technology and focus our efforts on those that are more vulnerable in the community. And that's what this is about in our austere times. So the dimensions are immense.
I can imagine, and you've also got different organisations working together, but different sectors is certainly what we see, everyone collaborating. This was represented by the panel here today, just so many different people working together. Brian, depending on which hat I suppose you want to answer this with, that you referred to earlier, you've been a champion of patient record access before. Could you give the audience some insight into that? This was in the context of the discussion that we're having today.
Yes, of course. So it's one of perhaps the most obvious thing that's happened in the NHS so far as people are concerned. So it's now possible, and it's been possible since 2015 for anybody in England to have access to their GP records and to be able to book appointments online and to order their repeat prescriptions online. And it's still not that well known, but it has been available and it is available. And I've been working in the field for some time, and for many years, doctors in particular thought that people having access to their GP records was the work of the devil, and that the universe would almost certainly fall apart if that happened. I remember in the early stages, people said to me, well, if people have access to the records, they'll be so distressed they'll jump off buildings. And the reality is that it's quite the opposite. It brings people together, it improves trust, it improves information, it's safer, it's more effective, and that's what this kind of process is all about. But it does challenge, or can challenge, existing culture and standards. And I think GPs who are now probably the most advanced in terms of tech in the world, our primary care sector is virtually paperless, has now turned around and is using it routinely, and it becomes part of business as usual. So it's a very interesting development, I think, and it shows how government can really make a difference to just day-to-day work and support people in shifting their approach over time.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed change. It was almost subtle in some ways. People just saw the benefit, didn't they, of being able to do that, and forgot about some of the things that you mentioned before around
yes, indeed,
doing the work. Excellent. And Richard, in your role within the NCVO, what does digital mean, and I suppose what have some of the wins been for you as an organisation?
Well, both for the organisation, but I think we spoke earlier on about the impact that takes place for the charities and the community groups that we're working with and supporting. And I was sort of going to try and focus on some practical examples. So guide dogs have been exploring how they can use technology for people with limited vision, and how actually that can change the number of people that they can actually work with. There are some challenges there because people unfortunately or fortunately give money for dogs, not necessarily for the people who have limited vision. But that's a really important and practical example for me. I think we spoke about transparency there, which is hugely important for the sector, both in terms of how we explain what we're doing with people's money, and whether that be government money or individual givers and donors. So transparency, hugely important. Data, and for NCVO this has been a real sort of eye-opener. Lots of people moaned about the GDPR, acronym again, sorry.
Yeah, I know.
But that was the concern was that we were losing 30% of our data. I personally was delighted because the 30% that we lost was actually data that wasn't worthwhile exploring and looking at. So we've been using that to look at the user experience, how they actually visit our site, because a lot of our work is digital. And also about how we can understand our members and their needs much more effectively and actually target what they want to them rather than just chucking everything at them at once. So, for that, both for NCVO, but that's also hugely important in the sector. People are always concerned about data, obviously from your perspective for GPs, but also lots of charities are dealing with very sensitive personal data.
Yeah.
But if they understand the real needs of individuals down to sort of quite an individual, very small level, they can look at how they can tailor their services, all work in collaboration, Nadira. That's so important to actually deliver the right services to the right people at the right time. So I think it hasn't had as much of an impact yet in the sector. There has been a grant recently from DCMS, £15 million, which is peanuts in the real sense of the word, but actually quite a lot of money for the charity world to look at how they can use their technology, digital technology, better. And NCVO has been on a big journey, and we've invested, for NCVO's context, a lot of money, over £500,000 in the last 4 years, in our digital competency. And your point about our sort of IT people, as I would call them, and our digital people, not necessarily being joined up as they might have been, is beginning to change.
Yeah.
And that's that's a huge possibility of how people can deliver better services, show their outcomes more effectively. Maybe we can be less on the back foot of being criticised like the public sector is, as well as the charity world, for individual examples where I think people haven't behaved properly, to show the amazing work that takes place in the general space in our society today. So for me, it actually has a big cultural opportunity to change people's perspective of what happens in terms of a functional and effective society.
Craig, can I just pick up on that point?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Go ahead.
So I think you make a really valid point, Richard, and I started to articulate, breaking down some of those kind of silo attitudes and behaviours. It is absolutely about a cultural paradigm shift. It is about not only just expecting our ICT and digital folk to have that expertise. It is very much, if we're going to ensure that we're delivering to customer need, it is absolutely about the business, on behalf of their customers, being able to articulate what those requirements are, and working with our ICT and digital experts to ensure that we can deliver those products and services far more in a joined-up way. So some of these kind of barriers that have existed previously in the stereotypes about the areas of expertise residing within distinct services and units, it's very much a senior leadership conundrum. It's very much about having that holistic view about need and working in a joined-up way to deliver that need, I think.
I would say it's not really a conundrum. It's really just something that needs to be challenged and done properly. It's not difficult to do.
No.
To bring your digital engagers in a business together with those that lead maybe the tech bit at the back end. And it's only really been in the last, let's say, 5 or 6 years where it's become absolutely imperative that those two lines are really closely joined. And I think in a business, the representation of those two parties should be at an operational level consistently. And they need to work together, whether it's in a reporting line or whatever way it happens, but there has to be a structure of cohesion. Because if you don't have that, you will have a continuation of siloed data, which is really that's really the result of what all this has brought about, because businesses have had to move forward with their digital endeavours, and it's been the marketing and digital communicators that have done those things on their own initiative, which is fine because businesses have to move forward, and left the IT bits behind because obviously that part of the structural elements has been misunderstood or not recognised. And now we have to play catch-up, but rather than just playing catch-up all the time, bring them together and make sure that moving forward is done in a consistent and cohesive way.
Absolutely.
That is quite difficult to do.
It is.
I think.
I don't think it's as difficult as people make out, because it is a people thing. A people thing and a process thing. As long as it comes as a leadership directive from up high in terms of how the operations of a business need to function, it is doable.
Oh yes, I'm not saying it's not doable, but so in the NHS, for instance, we have very interesting disruptive developments. So the tech sector has developed this thing called GP at hand, which you may have heard about. So this is video consultations, and it does seem really a neat solution to primary care access. But in operation, what it has done is hollowed out large sections of the NHS. It makes life extremely difficult for practices and actually doesn't meet the majority of patients' needs either. So that's a process from the tech sector, which seems like a very good idea, but when you actually see how it operates in the real world, it doesn't look quite so neat anymore. So these things are quite complex, and they require both the tech sector and the statutory sector and the voluntary sector really to talk together, and that is certainly not a simple process.
Brian, I agree. I mean, I think because it is actually predominantly a people issue. Technology is a tool that we're there to use, and to some extent, some people want to make it a special tool. Therefore, nobody else should know what it is. My colleagues, bless them, on the digital side, keep talking about sprints, and I sort of say to them, "Isn't that suck it and see?" And they talk about MVPs, which is very, very sensible, and it's a really important and useful way to develop services, ideas, products. But actually, it doesn't need to be couched in such a way that almost excludes a large number of people. And I think, going back to your comment, that there are many people who would visit their GP who wouldn't feel comfortable using an online video digital consultation. There are people who actually, as I think we said earlier on, who will go to their GP because they're lonely. Now, if they were going to a local charity or a local statutory, there used to be services, I'm not sure there are many of that now, unfortunately, because of austerity, then that might help. But that joined up bit is complex. It's not complicated, and you have to, for me, complexity is great as long as you can find an integrated solution. And it's getting people to actually give up a bit sometimes, both in power terms and in being absolutely honest about what can and can't be done. And that's also, I think, is quite difficult in technology terms. There are people who want to be on the bleeding edge, who will tell you everything can be done by technology. And there are people, for me, who are pragmatic and actually can make things change. And people will believe if they can see things actually happening that impact on their lives.
Yeah.
So I think there's an interesting challenge.
I think, going back to that, and completely accept that point, obviously, particularly in something that's as large as the NHS. But I think, when you've got parties, such as the traditional IT or the digital team working together, that doesn't mean that they are the decision makers. They need to collaborate.
Absolutely.
But what really sits underneath all of that is the governance of good decision making in terms of what needs to happen as a result of that collaboration. And that's the important thing, to make decisions that are based on sensible outcomes. So in your example, then that decision would have been made not to progress with that because the evidence isn't there that brings any benefit. So technology for technology's sake is never going to really work, or very rarely, as we all know. And that's just an absolute good example of that.
That's really interesting concepts and topics there. I'm quite interested to understand a bit more about that then. So, Nadira, perhaps from your perspective, there we're talking about organisations individually changing and people being part of the process. But what are you seeing across the local government space, where I guess the complexity is
huge, absolutely huge. So if we look at, the dimensions once again, the context, austerity, Richard, you've just mentioned, people's increased expectations, the increase in demand. We're an ageing population. If you look just from a social care perspective, probably the biggest budget from a local government perspective. Without a doubt, we have to respond accordingly. We have to, and I made the point earlier, it's not about moving deck chairs on the Titanic anymore. It's not about salami slicing. It's not about what can we do less of. We can shut libraries. But we absolutely need to use the current climate to think far more creatively and far more innovatively. We also need to ensure, from a local government perspective, from the way in which our organisations operate, we have the political dimension. What is the risk appetite within our organisations? How are we may have great ideas and aspirations to deliver good transformational outcomes, but what is the risk appetite of the organisation? Do we want to be bleeding edge? Do we want to follow suit? Do we want to observe to see how things are taking place in the market first? So that's really important. We've all defined business or user need. I think that's absolutely fundamental to how we move forward as organisations. They've got to be based on what is it that our customers are telling us. So how can we devise customer-centric, customer-focused solutions through co-production, through co-creation? That's the biggest change I think that we're seeing, in that how do we engage with the people that we serve to come and tell us if something is going to work effectively or not? Previously, our mindset has been very much, we've got some technology, let's throw it over the fence. Sure. Will it meet a purpose? Well, time will tell. So we are absolutely changing the mindset now to say service design is fundamental in everything that we do. And actually, when we talk about process design, are we tinkering with processes and making them more effective, or do we do away with processes that have existed possibly unnecessarily to date? That's the challenge. Yep. That's absolutely the challenge. So I think, some really, really interesting and exciting times. I don't think we're there. We've got all the obvious challenges that we've just described. Yeah, sure. But it absolutely gives us an opportunity to think outside of the box.
And there are some absolute gems. I mean, there are some wonderful small projects that are undertaken. And for me, there are two which stand out. One was where young runners, runner clubs, talked about young runner clubs earlier on, visiting older people, and they run as they finish their run. And linking that, so people obviously, the safeguarding issues, people are concerned about people coming to knock on their door, but actually if they know, and notification we spoke about through the housing associations, actually that for me is a real sweet spot, but that's one little example happening in one particular place as a local response. And I think one of our biggest challenges sort of in government terms is actually we want to deliver local, but actually we want to see something that could be taken and brought to scale. But trying to do that isn't always possible because the different elements of that are there. For me also, I think that you can see some organisations who one was in a spin out, from the National Health Service some time ago in Grimsby, who were working in a much more integrated way with people who would be social workers as well as people who coroners. So, one of their biggest issues, people ringing up saying, I found my partner, older couples predominantly, has died. Actually, they would have the social service individual there at the same time as actually the people were turning up, the GP or the paramedics were turning up, and they integrated that at the local level. And you think, God, that's sensible. Rather than, and it was done through digital technology. And they were able to keep in touch with people and put the right people in the right place. And so there are wonderful examples of these things happening throughout the country, both in the statutory service and in the sort of charity world. But we don't seem to be able to take them, bring them to scale, and then sort of say, well, that can be done and solve certain issues. And the complexities, maybe it can't be brought to scale. Maybe it can just be different ways to deliver it in different places.
Well, I think, the world of technology has become so complex because of the volume of new technology that comes to market. And so you've got a juxtaposition of large behemoths that, continue to dominate the landscape in many ways. But you've got loads of entrants to market with solutions that are more cost effective for people who can afford it. And therefore you have to say, why should I be paying this and using a big solution when I could be doing this and getting exactly the same thing? What you end up with is something that actually works for that person, but potentially you've got a lack of integration and connectivity between these areas. And that is a big challenge. And that would be particularly true for something like, the NHS, for example.
And us.
Yeah, and you.
Totally.
There's another element, I think, which is that there is tech solutions, but there's a sort of yawning gap in trying to harness them for things. So with my NHS Alliance hat, what we're really interested in is how communities can take more control of their lives and their environments. And we know from the evidence that if you build contact between people, you support them with confidence and enable them to take more control, that is enormously health-giving. So people get healthier if they have more control over their lives. And really tech should be able to help with that. It's what Facebook does, it does what WhatsApp does, it's all these things. But actually there is very little tech interest or tech involvement, and I think NCVO and the kind of community development world may have to think much more carefully about that sort of thing. So in Barcelona there is a tech solution called DeciDim, and it's used as a sort of participatory democracy for the population of Barcelona. So they get involved in, it's not a referendum, but they do get involved with all sorts of planning. They set the agenda. It's a completely different approach to how government and local government works. And it's the tech that makes the difference. But of course, in order for that change to happen, you need local communities to be making that demand. And you need the statutory sector to say, yes, we will listen and we will shift as a result of these kind of changes. So there's a strong, it seems to me, political dimension as well, that tech is around, but it could be harnessed in so many different ways. And we need political and statutory interest in those kinds of things.
And really just picking up on that point, tech, but I think more importantly data and data insights, and using that insight in an intelligible way to make some of those evidence-based decisions. So very much place-based outcomes, joining up as we've talked about, but how can we use the data to better inform us in terms of where there are trouble hotspots, how we can help with that kind of, Brian, you mentioned the kind of healthy and well communities. It's certainly something that we very much are focusing on from SOCITM's perspective on behalf of our members, but it's how can we help with that left shift? How can we focus more on the preventative aspects of creating healthy and well communities rather than pump priming the cure aspects? So using that data to give us the insight, where are there troubled families? Where are there vulnerable folk? Where are there crime hotspots?
And we've got there's a good example of that when I was mentioning earlier sort of some of the innovation programs that are underway through our Creating Our Futures at the National Housing Federation. And there was talk of using machine learning for housing associations to detect patterns of behaviour of tenants, so that at the moment, as a good example, if you don't pay your rent X number of times and you sent a letter and at some point or other
Off to court.
You're off to court. But what happens in a community when somebody is actually suffering from either mental health issues or other problems, the social care aspect of it, just through machine learning of data, patterns of behaviour detected against certain tenants, for example, which can then allow the housing associations to leverage that information to actually engage at that point and make sure that there's preventative measure going on as opposed to something that is punitive. And that's a very good example of how data with machine learning can be used.
I think that's absolutely right. And there's a new development in the NHS. It's all being re-disorganised again, and we've got these primary care networks that are starting, which are relatively local organisations now. And it's always seemed to me and to the NHS Alliance that working with housing is one of the really important things that we, obviously the local authority, but housing is a sort of missed out bit, I think. And you do have this data. So I see a person in front of me, I know their address, I kind of know vaguely about them, but if I've never visited them at home, I know very little about their social circumstances unless I ask them in detail. But you do know about those things, and you would know the people at most financial and emotional risk in a way that perhaps we wouldn't. So somehow GDPR accepting, permitting, if those things could be shared, I think we would have enormous benefits at very little cost. I mean, it would be dead simple to do technically. It's obviously the permissions that would be required, but that's the sort of cross-sector work that I think has potentially enormous impacts on.
Let me tell you, one of the things I think is about, we talked earlier on about it being a human solution as well, people solution. So I know of examples where charities who are helping vulnerable older people actually are working with gas board and with fire brigade, who go to check various things in people's houses and actually will with permission, report back that this person hasn't used the stove for the last 3 months, if ever. They're not getting, because of the social care pressure, they're not getting any food delivered anymore. So that's a really amazing one. Another one which is slightly tangential was Macmillan working with pharmacists who retired. So apparently pharmacists who retire have a fairly high death rate because they go from seeing people daily. They're part of the community. They go into retirement. They're not careful. They don't actually have that engagement anymore. So they were actually facilitating a process where pharmacists know what cancer you've got, because they'll see what the drugs are, and actually then could offer some degree of advice or point them in the direction of other advice. And technology will speed those processes up. So I think that they're incredibly useful. But we also have to overcome a natural disdain in our society at the moment about data. You look at the fake news and what happened with the last elections, with with the sort of various organisations who rightly or wrongly, I think rightly, are accused of sort of using data erroneously. And so in a way, we're saying technology is great. Most of us, just use our whatever's and think it's a phone, and it's not, of course. And then there's the other bit that people, it's become ubiquitous, but there's still a great deal of distrust. So it's a power dynamic issue. You're right in terms of politics, but it's also power dynamics. And I think the other thing that strikes me is that much of Europe is much more, we're the most centralised, one of the most centralised government bureaucracies in the world. I think Malta might be the next. Whereas actually in places like Spain, it's been much more community-driven for much longer than in the UK. So there's an interesting change. You're talking about transformation change. I think there'll be social change, which is required. And I'm not convinced the politicians looking at that.
Absolutely. And the point that I was just going to pick up on is that, you know, we've mentioned a number of technologies and data aspects that can be considered. There is an ethical dimension here, which is how do we use and deploy the technologies without impacting kind of compliance and accessibility issues. So from our perspective, we are championing and trying to understand what that actually means in practical terms. And quite often people kind of hide behind the guise of GDPR.
Agreed.
Right? But we've got to offer some practical guidance as to what is doable versus breach of kind of legal compliance rules and regulations. So for all the kind of emerging technologies, we are very much looking at the ethical dimension and how we can ensure that privacy, etc., as I've just said, is not compromised in any shape, way or form. And there is a lot of information and advice and guidance now available, but it's about, once again, signposting, being very practical and ensuring that we're not using it as a kind of hurdle and a hindrance, but using it to absolutely propagate and use this technology and capability more effectively.
Yeah. Absolutely, completely agree. Really interesting discussions there. Just for the last 8 minutes or so, time is flying by. Some really great discussion here. I'm going to use digital technology because we have actually had some questions coming in from our viewers as we've been talking. So I'll just throw out there whoever feels best placed to answer. I've been told these are the best of the best. That's some good questions. So we have Nick, who's based in Warwickshire, and he's asked, organisations like ours are desperate to improve how we learn, transform and improve services. How do we implement agile methodology in a local authority working practice and services when agile is based on software development? So I guess his question is, how do we think differently about agile rather than from a software point of view to transformations?
I think it's an interesting question because I think the word agile has been sort of bandied around quite a lot in recent years. And obviously from a software development point of view, it's what we were talking about earlier. It's about sprints and going through very quick cycles of development. But I think the important aspect of that methodology that has found its way into day-to-day operations is the fact that you've got that bridge between the technical team and the business, and they're working very closely together, understand what the client wants and deliver on the other hand. Now, as soon as that methodology from a technical point of view is imposed on a business, it automatically shakes up the way that that business is working because it demands a different operating model. And that in itself is something that's causing a bit of ruckus now and people saying, well, how do we do this? And I think the answer to that gentleman's question is that you start with small projects, but you have you work on the basis of inclusion. So you have a good representative group of people, let's say in a local authority, who are part of that project. And it starts over a period of time and over a period of projects to filter into the way that that organisation works, because it then becomes part of a working practice of the individual that becomes the collective. I don't think it will ever work if it's an imposition of an operating model, particularly not in something like a local authority or some potentially other rigid structure. But you can start going from a small nucleus and start building it out so it becomes a behaviour as opposed to a dictated methodology.
I would agree. Sorry, Richard.
No,
so culture, mindset, the way in which an organisation looks at the importance of doing things differently. It is also about looking at best practice and how other organisations have implemented projects, products, services rather than continuing. So agility for me is about what else is happening in my locality or in my sector or the private sector. And we must stop just looking in an insular way. This is about learning from the best in class. What can we do to help facilitate learning quickly? Richard mentioned minimum viable product. We absolutely have come from a place where we've been fixated on, we've described that we want to deliver this, so we will deliver this. And when we take it to our recipient and they say that's not what we asked for, we then have to start again. So failing fast and minimal viable product are absolutely where we need to take this conversation so that we can showcase the art of the possible, get buy-in early and iterate and evolve.
So, to me, you need to have the vested interests involved. I mean, one of the issues often is the unintended consequences of agile development might be that people lose their jobs. And that's a very, very touchy subject in many organisations, not just in local authorities and in the private sector, except they're slightly more cutthroat than we might be in terms of how we deal with that. And I think that that's quite an interesting cultural perspective, is not does this actually deliver? And of course, the recipients of the service. That's one of the things that even to this day, you can look at private sector examples where things are being developed, but they aren't appropriate. And there are many, many young startups who come to me with technological digital solutions and they say, this is wonderful for the sector. And I'll say, well, have you tested it? Have you looked at it? Have you gone out and talked to people? No. I say, well, go away. And when you have, come back and talk to us. And so you're absolutely right. There's a sort of interesting dynamic about how do you combine agile development, but not just from a technological perspective, because it is a behavioural issue as well.
It is, absolutely.
I don't have it. Everything's been said.
Everything's been covered. Well, we have less than 5 minutes, so I'll ask this one very quickly. We may have to cut it short. The sun is now starting to come out over London Bridge behind us as well. This is, I have to rattle through these, but Lee Gridley, NHS, he's asked, what do you think the top 3 tips are for bringing non-digital natives with you on a path towards digital collaboration? It's a broad question, but it may just be quick fire, just a couple of thoughts before we wrap up.
Self-interest. How does it benefit them?
Absolutely.
Patient interest. How does it benefit patients?
Yeah.
And what's the evidence? Show me that it works and that it makes a difference to people.
Absolutely. I would have replicated this. You can't convince people to come on a journey unless they understand what the benefits are and what's in it for me, what's in it for the people that I'm helping to deliver the change for. So I concur. It is absolutely... and then referencing tangible outcomes elsewhere that have delivered good outcomes. That, for me, is the biggest thing. If we are going to win the trust and confidence of these folk, and folk I'm using in the broadest sense, the people we work with, the people we deliver services to, it is about evidencing and showing where something has demonstrated good outcomes.
I'd also say don't let those that can be ignored obstruct progress. Because, that is also a point. There are definitely people who really become quite obstructive and don't want to move on with technology. And I think, if you're flogging a dead horse, leave it dead, But, on the other hand, I think, working, as my colleagues say, working with, your peers and asking for them to contribute their experience to a technical project is great, because it's not about technology, it's about experience. And, that's a really valid contribution for people who might actually normally shy away from the techie stuff, because it's more than just the technology.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, about the person as well. Richard, any?
Only to build on what Brian said, really, was actually show them things that have worked. And actually do work, can work, and do deliver. But actually also show them what people have done to address many of these issues that you've talked about. Because, yes, there are people we can ignore, but for instance, Board of Trustees, one, not mine, I'm glad to say, who are very positive about our investment, but actually people that you can't ignore them.
Oh, of course,
so there are power structures within the organisation which are very difficult to ignore. Unions sometimes can't be ignored, but they need to be shown that there is value and that people can be applied in other ways to deliver better work for the beneficiaries. And
finally, to the point about, turkeys voting for Christmas and the loss of potential jobs through the kind of exponential rate of change. It's about the way in which we can reskill our workforce to apply them elsewhere in more value-add, meaningful roles
Yep.
and responsibilities. And I think, and not always, but hopefully where we can, we should be promoting that message too.
I think that's a great point to bring us to the end to what I think has been a really interesting discussion. So thank you, Richard, Brian, Nadira and Carolyn, for representing all these cross sectors. I think just some really, really interesting topics. So thank you all. Thank you to all the viewers. I will be following up with an email to everyone after the session today. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion, and we look forward to speaking with you soon, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you.